In the final months of 1945, Japan prepared to fight the war inside its own towns. The empire had lost everything, the navy shattered, the air force crippled, its cities reduced to ashes by American firebombing. Tokyo, once the world's largest city, lay in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had not yet been destroyed, but the writing was already on the wall. Japan's leaders knew the invasion was coming, the Allied landings that would bring the war home. And so they made one final decision. If soldiers could not stop the enemy, civilians would. In June of that year, the government issued the Volunteer Fighting Corps Ordinance. It was not a suggestion, it was an order. Every man between 15 and 60 and every woman between 17 and 40 would become a soldier. They would fight with whatever they had, kitchen knives, sickles, and most of all, sharpened bamboo poles. Japan was turning its people into weapons. By the summer of 1945, schools were no longer schools. They were training grounds. Classrooms became armories. Playgrounds became drill fields. Teachers led their students in shouts of "Tenno Haika Banzai, long live the emperor," while holding nothing but wooden sticks. One 14-year-old girl wrote in her diary, "I will defend the emperor with my bamboo spear. I wonder if it will hurt." The line says everything. It was not courage, it was confusion. A child who still wondered if a sharpened pole could kill or be killed was now told to stand against tanks and flamethrowers. The tragedy was not that they fought, it was that they believed they had to. Across Japan, millions trained for an invasion that never came. The elderly were told to strap explosives to their bodies. Mothers practiced stabbing straw dummies in schoolyards. And students' children were told that dying for their emperor was more beautiful than living in defeat. It was a plan born of desperation, and deep down, almost everyone knew it. A Tokyo factory worker later recalled, "We had no guns, no food, not even enough cloth for uniforms. Still, they told us to be ready." When historians speak of the Pacific War's final phase, they talk of the bombs, the surrenders, the cities. But rarely do they speak of those who never went to the front lines because the front lines came to them. This is their story. The story of schoolgirls drilling with bamboo poles, of mothers sewing makeshift uniforms for battles that would never happen, of teachers who watched their students prepare to die. It is a story not of bravery or honor, but of how war devours everything, even innocence. By the end of this video, you will see how an entire nation, starving, burning, and desperate, was asked to fight the most powerful armies in the world with nothing but sticks. They fought with bamboo spears, knowing it would never be enough. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a country waiting for the end. Every night, the sky turned red. B-29 seconds roared overhead, dropping hundreds of tons of fire on wooden cities built long before anyone imagined such a war. Whole neighborhoods vanished before dawn. In Tokyo alone, more than 100,000 civilians had already perished. The rice harvest had failed. Trains no longer ran on schedule. The lights in most homes stayed dark to save electricity that barely existed. Bread was replaced with sweet potato paste. Children stood in line for bowls of barley gruel. The word everyone whispered but never said aloud was invasion. The Japanese High Command called it Operation Ketsu Go, the decisive defense of the homeland. On paper, it looked strategic. In reality, it was a fantasy built on exhaustion. The plan assumed that every citizen, soldier or not, would fight to the last breath. Leaflets and radio broadcasts promised the people that the emperor's divine wind would protect them, just as the typhoon had saved Japan from the Mongols centuries earlier. The idea wasn't military, it was spiritual. If the nation believed strongly enough, perhaps the enemy would fall. But belief could not stop bullets. In cities like Osaka and Kobe, local officials called public meetings to explain the new order. Families were told that when the Americans landed, they must resist. The tools of daily life, kitchen knives, scythes, carpentry saws, became potential weapons. Children were told to memorize slogans, "Even with a bamboo spear, we will fight." A woman in Nagoya later remembered, "They said the enemy would burn our houses and hurt our families. We were told to die before they could touch us." The people obeyed, not because they wanted to die, but because disobedience meant shame. After 15 years of total war, obedience had become instinct. At the same time, Japan's leaders were trapped by their own propaganda. To admit defeat was unthinkable. To negotiate surrender risked assassination. So they continued the illusion, preparing millions for a battle they knew could not be won. In small towns, mayors stood before frightened crowds and recited the same promise. "If the enemy lands, we will drive him into the sea with bamboo spears." Each word echoed more hollowly than the last. Inside the imperial palace, some generals still dreamed of victory. Outside its gates, people slept in burned houses and empty fields. A Tokyo shopkeeper wrote in his journal, "We live between air raids. I sell nothing now, but each morning I still open the door. I suppose that is also a kind of fighting." By mid-July, entire prefectures were reduced to rubble. Yet broadcasts continued to promise a decisive battle on the mainland. Every family was ordered to register at the local defense bureau. Wooden practice rifles were handed out like toys. Teenagers drilled in the streets, shouting words that no longer sounded real. One eyewitness recalled, "When the sirens stopped after a bombing, we didn't rebuild, we just dug trenches and waited." Japan had become a fortress made of ash. Still, the people waited for direction, and what came next would take that despair and shape it into something even more tragic. But when they said everyone, they meant even the children. Their classrooms became barracks. By the middle of 1944, Japan's military had run out of men. The empire's armies were shattered across the Pacific, its pilots dying faster than they could be trained. The answer, the government decided, was to reach deeper into society, into the schools. The student labor and volunteer corps transformed millions of boys and girls into auxiliary soldiers. At first, they were sent to factories, helping build aircraft parts or assemble ammunition. But as the war came closer, the work changed. The teachers no longer handed out books, they handed out bamboo poles. Photographs from that time show schoolyards filled with lines of children wearing white headbands and faded work uniforms. Their faces were serious, their expressions older than their years. They were taught to shout, to march, to thrust their spears into straw dummies while shouting, "Banzai." A 17-year-old boy from Fukuoka later wrote, "We practice thrusting again and again until our arms ache." The teacher says to aim for the stomach, but sometimes, when I look at my friends, I think we are the ones being prepared to be stabbed. In many schools, lessons were replaced entirely with military instruction. Blackboards displayed attack diagrams instead of arithmetic. Students memorized slogans, 100 million hearts, one spirit. The irony was cruel. The government told them they were the future of Japan, and then it ordered them to throw that future away. One teacher recalled, "We had no choice. We drilled the students as instructed. But when I saw them stumble under the weight of those wooden rifles, I wanted to cry. They were just children." Soldiers were barely 12 years old. Others were university students who had dreamed of becoming doctors or engineers. By 1945, they were all categorized as reserve combatants. The youngest among them practiced stabbing sandbags while air raid sirens wailed overhead. One boy's final diary entry read, "Tomorrow we will dig defensive trenches by the river. They say the enemy is near. I wonder if they are boys like us." The mobilization stripped childhood from an entire generation. Games disappeared from the playgrounds. Graduation ceremonies were cancelled, replaced by patriotic rallies where students pledged to defend the emperor to the last. Parents could do little but watch. Some mothers sewed headbands embroidered with the rising sun, hoping it would protect their children. Others refused to attend the send-off ceremonies, unable to bear the sight. One woman remembered standing behind a tree as her son's class marched by. She said softly, "I wanted to call his name, but I was afraid someone would hear me." The illusion of victory was collapsing. Yet, in every corner of Japan, the sound of bamboo spears striking straw filled the air, a hollow rhythm of obedience echoing through a dying empire. For the students, that sound was supposed to symbolize strength. But in truth, it was the sound of youth being buried before its time. And still, they believed because they had been taught to believe. They believed the Americans would land any day. They believed dying for the emperor was the greatest honor. And they believed that somehow, even with bamboo, they could protect their home. Before we continue, if stories like this matter to you, take a moment to subscribe. It helps us keep these voices alive and ensures that the children who trained for a battle they never fought are never forgotten. But even their teachers knew bamboo was no match for fire. When steel ran out, they turned to bamboo. By 1945, Japan's war industry was collapsing. The mines were empty, the factories bombed, the transport lines destroyed. The country that had once built aircraft carriers and tanks could now barely make bicycles. So the government issued a new weapon to its people, a piece of sharpened bamboo, about 2 meters long, hardened in fire. Every home was encouraged to make one. Newspapers printed diagrams showing how to carve, dry, and polish the tip. Radio programs taught women how to thrust and twist as if killing a man. In public squares, families gathered to train. Grandmothers stood beside schoolchildren, stabbing straw dummies and shouting slogans. Propaganda films showed young women in white blouses, smiling as they practiced. The narration promised, even with bamboo spears, the spirit of Japan will prevail. But in private, most people knew the truth. A woman from Shizuoka remembered her instructor's words, "When the enemy comes, aim for the stomach or eyes. If he has a gun, do not be afraid. Die bravely." She was 17. Her friend beside her carried not a spear, but a broom handle. There weren't enough bamboo poles to go around. In some villages, the weapons were simply wooden sticks painted black. Children were told to imagine they were rifles. The government printed manuals showing them how to attack tanks by shoving poles into treads, drawings of bravery disconnected entirely from reality. One farmer's wife later said, "They told us the Americans would land and we must fight them hand to hand." But how could bamboo stop bullets? Even as we shouted our oaths, we were trembling. Still they trained, because fear of shame was stronger than fear of death. By June, the bamboo spear had become a national symbol of unity, sacrifice, and futility. Even the newspapers used the phrase, "the bamboo spirit of Japan," as a rallying cry. Photographs taken by Allied reconnaissance planes showed groups of people moving in open fields, spears in hand. The US analysts didn't understand at first. They thought it might be farming. It wasn't. It was a country preparing to die. One 16-year-old student later recalled, "We practiced stabbing until our hands blistered. At night, I cried because my palms burned and because I knew it wouldn't matter." The cruelty was not in the weapon itself, it was in the belief that it could work. By that point, Japan had almost no gunpowder left. Ammunition was hoarded for the army. But the government's broadcasts kept promising miracles, divine winds, new weapons, secret technologies. The bamboo spear was a tool to sustain the illusion of hope. A historian later wrote, "The spear was not meant to win battles. It was meant to keep the people obedient until the end." And it worked. Throughout that summer, people continued to drill, knowing the invasion might come any day. The sound of shouting echoed through rice fields and bombed-out streets, a strange orchestra of despair disguised as patriotism. They practiced courage because they had no choice. A girl in Hiroshima wrote, "We will fight with bamboo, but I wish I could see my brother again before the enemy comes." She never did. Still, the government demanded more. They were mothers, not soldiers, but the government no longer cared. In the spring of 1945, Japan created a new civilian army, the Volunteer Fighting Corps. It sounded noble, patriotic even, but what it meant was that every woman between the ages of 15 and 40 was now a soldier in name. They received armbands, wooden training rifles, and bamboo poles. Few had ever fired a gun, most had never even held one, yet they were told that when the Americans came, they would fight. Posters went up across cities and villages, drawings of smiling women holding spears, their hair tied neatly, their eyes bright with determination. The slogan said, "Protect the homeland," and every woman a shield of Japan. Those posters were women who barely slept, who scavenged for food in bombed-out markets, and who were told to die if captured. A mother from Kagoshima later wrote, "We were given spears and told to practice. I thought of my baby at home and wondered what would happen if I had to use it. How could I hold a weapon when my hands should hold him?" Training sessions were surreal. Housewives lined up in fields to learn how to throw grenades, though there were no grenades to throw. The instructors used stones. In Tokyo, a teacher described watching her students' mothers being drilled in bayonet tactics, while air raid sirens sounded in the distance. "It was like a dream," she said, "but one you couldn't wake from." The volunteer corps wasn't just for city women. In rural areas, farmers' wives were told to protect their villages with bamboo spears. Some were taught to make Molotov cocktails from sake bottles. Others were told to rush tanks with explosives strapped to their waists. There was no strategy, only despair disguised as duty. A young widow recalled, "They told us to hide our children in the mountains, then return to fight. I couldn't understand it. If I died, who would feed them?" For the first time, women who had spent years holding families together now faced orders to abandon them, and still, most obeyed. Not because they believed in victory, but because they feared being labeled a coward. The volunteer corps became the government's final illusion, that the spirit of motherhood itself could repel the invasion. One American intelligence report later noted, "Japanese women are being mobilized to fight. They are practicing with sticks and poles. It is impossible to imagine what will happen if the invasion proceeds." The truth is, everyone already knew. If the Allies had landed, these women, farmers, mothers, and daughters would have stood on the beaches, holding bamboo spears against machine guns. And perhaps that is the deepest tragedy of all, that in those last months, love itself was turned into a weapon. A mother in Osaka said quietly, "They said I must die for my country, but my country was my children. If you had to defend your family with nothing but courage, what would you do?" Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your words help keep these memories alive and remind us what war truly costs. To live was shameful, to die was noble. That was the message drilled into Japan's people for 15 years, from kindergarten songs to imperial rescripts. The idea ran deeper than patriotism. It was identity. The emperor was sacred, the homeland divine. To surrender was not just defeat, it was sin. By the last months of 1945, this belief had hardened into something far darker. Even as the nation starved, even as the skies burned, government broadcasts repeated the same command: to die for the emperor is the highest honor. In one radio address, a general declared, "If the enemy lands, every man will kill 10, every woman 5, and every child 1. The numbers were impossible, but they were never meant to be true, only to be believed. A teacher from Nagano remembered gathering her class in the schoolyard after hearing that speech. They told me to inspire the children. I looked at their faces, at their small hands, and all I could say was, "Do your best." Even now, those words haunt me. In Okinawa, where the fighting had already begun, the effects were catastrophic. Civilians there were told that Americans would torture and kill them. Families were given grenades, with one pin pulled, instructed to take their own lives if capture seemed near. Thousands did. When survivors were later interviewed, many said the same thing. They had not feared the enemy. They had feared the shame of surrender. A mother who lived through Okinawa said, "We were told that being captured would disgrace our ancestors. I believed it. Everyone did." This same indoctrination spread across the mainland. Newspapers printed articles praising those who had died beautifully. Young students were told to emulate the kamikaze, pure, selfless, and unafraid. But many were afraid. They just couldn't say it aloud. A 17-year-old girl from Yokohama wrote in her diary, "If the enemy comes, I will not run. But I am not brave. I only fear that my family will be ashamed." It's hard to imagine now, but in that time, pride was stronger than survival. The entire culture had been reshaped to equate death with dignity. To live was to betray the emperor. To surrender was to betray everyone. Even after the atomic bombs fell, even after the emperor's surrender speech, some refused to believe it was over. A few soldiers in remote areas continued to train civilians, insisting the order must be false. Others wept not with relief, but with guilt for surviving. One former army cadet said years later, "When we heard the emperor's voice, I felt both joy and shame. Joy that it was finished. Shame that I was still alive." That was the cost of the ideology, a nation that had forgotten how to live without dying for something. In the end, it was this mindset that made the mobilization of civilians possible. If death was an honor, then giving bamboo spears to children made sense. If surrender was a disgrace, then teaching mothers to stab tanks was logical. The tragedy of Japan's last defense wasn't only in the weapons they lacked, it was in the beliefs they held. And even then, the leaders still spoke of victory. If the invasion had come, the bamboo spears would have met machine guns. The Allied invasion of Japan, code-named Operation Downfall, was set to be the largest amphibious assault in history. Plans were already in place, ready to bring death to millions. The U.S. military's objective was simple: crush the Japanese home islands once and for all. What wasn't clear, however, was how many civilians would have to die to make that happen. American intelligence believed that the Japanese military would defend the homeland with every available resource. What they didn't anticipate was the scale of civilian involvement. The Japanese government had told its people that an invasion would bring death, and the only way to avoid it was through absolute resistance. The plan to mobilize civilians began in earnest as early as late 1944, when the government issued its orders to equip everyone with weapons. The idea was to have every man, woman, and child take part in the defense. Farmers were given swords and spears, housewives were taught how to use grenades, and children practiced with bamboo poles. Yet, despite the illusion of readiness, Japan's military had barely enough weapons and ammunition for its own troops. In the end, civilians were the last line of defense. There was no place for them in the strategic calculations of war. They were simply disposable. The government believed that by sacrificing everyone, they could still maintain the image of a noble fight, even as the rest of the world closed in. Operation Downfall's first phase, Operation Olympic, was planned for November of 1945. It targeted the southernmost island of Kyushu. The U.S. Army anticipated a fight unlike anything the world had seen. Intelligence estimates suggested casualties could range from 1 million to 2 million. What was left out of those numbers was the true cost. How many Japanese civilians would be forced into combat? What most people don't realize is that Japan's final defensive plan wasn't just about military tactics. It was about keeping the nation's spirit intact. As much as it was about fighting off the invasion, it was about maintaining a sense of honor, a sense of nationhood. But the tragedy is that the people had no say in the matter. They had been told to fight until the last breath. Their worth had been reduced to their willingness to die for their country. U.S. military planners believed the battle for Kyushu could last for months, resulting in thousands of American casualties. But it was the Japanese casualties that would be devastating. Reports from the Japanese military suggested that nearly every civilian would be pressed into service, armed with whatever they could find. The government even encouraged the construction of barricades, trenches, and fortified positions throughout the country. And while most civilians still held bamboo spears, the true effectiveness of these weapons was something no one could deny. It was futile. One Japanese soldier, who later became a historian, remembered, "We were told to train civilians to use everything from axes to scythes. We knew it was hopeless, but we had no choice but to obey." As the battle for Kyushu loomed, even the Japanese generals began to acknowledge the staggering odds. They realized that the plan was doomed from the start. Yet, they kept pushing forward, as if the people's sacrifice could somehow tip the balance. The cruelty was not in the plan, it was in the belief that it could work. What would have happened if the invasion had occurred? The truth is unthinkable. Families would have been torn apart, mothers and children running toward the invaders with bamboo spears, only to be met by the overwhelming firepower of modern war. An American commander later recalled, "We knew Japan had mobilized its civilians. We thought they would fight, but we never realized they would be fighting for the sake of dying." The idea that Japan could win or even defend itself for long was false. The truth was much harsher. The people were the final defense because they had nowhere else to turn. They were trapped in an impossible system that demanded their sacrifice and their silence. And yet, they still fought, because they were taught that to live was to betray their emperor. Operation Downfall was never fully realized, and Japan's surrender came as a result of a different kind of destruction. But the civilian mobilization, the hopes placed on bamboo spears and misguided belief, remains one of the war's most haunting legacies. But the invasion never came. The end arrived from the sky. The bamboo spears never left the ground. In the summer of 1945, as civilians across Japan trained with wooden rifles and sharpened bamboo, the unimaginable happened. The war did not end with the invasion they had prepared for. It ended with a flash of light and a mushroom cloud. On August 6th, Hiroshima vanished. The world had never seen such destruction. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. For the people who had spent months drilling, training, and waiting for an invasion, the end came with a force they could neither see nor fight. For those who were mobilized, the sudden surrender came as a shock. The emperor, for the first time in history, addressed the nation through radio. His voice, calm yet heavy with grief, announced Japan's unconditional surrender. "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage," he said. It was a simple statement that belied the destruction already inflicted on the country. And in that moment, everything changed. The bamboo spears, which had been the last defense, were no longer needed. The wooden rifles, once so carefully carved, were left abandoned. The villagers who had been taught to fight with scythes and knives now turned back to their homes, unsure whether to feel relief or betrayal. A teacher from Kyoto recalled, "I didn't know whether to laugh or cry when we heard the announcement. We had been ready to die, but instead we were told to live." We didn't know what that meant anymore. For many, the defeat didn't bring the closure they expected. There was no glorious final battle, no heroic defense to remember. The fight never came, and so many had trained for nothing. The bamboo spears, once symbols of courage and duty, were reduced to strange artifacts, reminders of the tragedy of a war that asked everything of the people and gave nothing in return. Some veterans, who had seen their comrades die in battle, were left with a sense of guilt. "I trained civilians to fight," one former officer said. "I watched them drill with bamboo, knowing it was pointless. And when the war ended, I didn't know if I should feel relieved or ashamed. For the mothers who had raised their children to be soldiers, the end brought a similar confusion." One woman from Osaka described how her son, who had been practicing with a bamboo spear, returned home the day after the surrender. He was confused. He didn't know how to feel. He had been told to die for the emperor. Then he was told to live, but it felt like a betrayal. The realization that the invasion would never come, that the sacrifice would never happen, left an uncomfortable void. The civilians had prepared to die for a nation that would never ask them to, and yet they had been told it was their duty. It was all they knew. In the aftermath of the war, as Japan rebuilt, there was no national ceremony for those who had fought with bamboo. The memory was too painful. The images of school children training for a war that never came were swept into the shadows. For the families who had lost so much, it was easier to forget. And yet, the bamboo spears remained. Some families kept them in their homes as reminders of the war that had shaped their lives. Others buried them in gardens or fields, a quiet acknowledgement that the war was over, but its scars would never fade. The final tragedy of Japan's civilian mobilization wasn't just that the people had been asked to fight. It was that they had been taught to die for a war that never needed to be fought. In the silence that followed, the truth began to surface. They fought with bamboo, but what they were defending was not the emperor, it was the illusion of honor. In the final months of the war, Japan's people were asked to do the impossible. They were told to defend their homes with bamboo spears against an enemy armed with tanks, machine guns, and airplanes. The mobilization of civilians, particularly school children and women, was the ultimate expression of desperation. It was not a military strategy. It was a final plea, a cry for survival at any cost. What made this mobilization so tragic was that the people who fought with bamboo knew, deep down, that it would never be enough. They could feel it in their bones. The bamboo spears, the wooden rifles, the Molotov cocktails, none of them could stop the firepower of the American forces. But that didn't matter. They had been told it was their duty, and so they trained, they practiced. They believed that somehow, by dying for their country, they could preserve their honor. For the women, the children, and the elderly who were thrust into this final defense, there was no question of whether it would succeed. There was only the question of whether they could endure. "If we fight with everything we have," one mother wrote in her diary. "Even if we know we will die, we must die beautifully." But the war ended before this final battle could unfold. The surrender, when it came, was a shock. For those who had been trained to fight, it was a strange kind of betrayal. "We were told to die with honor," one veteran said. "But now we are asked to live. I don't know how to do that anymore." This feeling of betrayal was not limited to the soldiers who had been on the front lines. The civilians who had prepared to die were left without a place to mourn. The government that had urged them to sacrifice now told them to forget. They were to rebuild, to move on, to accept the reality of surrender. But how could they? How could you tell a mother who had taught her child to fight with bamboo that her sacrifice had meant nothing? How could you ask a teenager who had been trained to charge at enemy soldiers to suddenly accept peace without understanding the true cost of war? In the years that followed, the bamboo spear became a symbol, but not of victory. It became a reminder of a nation's lost innocence, of children who were turned into soldiers, of families who were asked to sacrifice everything for an ideal that had crumbled before them. And yet, despite the brutality of that final mobilization, there was a beauty in their resilience. These were not warriors by choice. They were people who, despite knowing the futility of their mission, fought anyway. They fought because they were told to, but also because they believed that by doing so, they could protect something sacred. The greatest tragedy of Japan's final defense wasn't that it was doomed to fail, it was that it never had to happen at all. The war could have ended sooner, the people could have been spared, but they were caught in the same tragic cycle that had driven them to fight in the first place, a belief that honor required sacrifice, no matter the cost. And yet, from the ashes of that sacrifice, something else was born, a new sense of peace, a promise that the horrors of war would never be repeated, that future generations would not be asked to die for illusions. The nation rebuilt, carrying with it a vow never again. If you believe these voices should never be forgotten, consider subscribing and sharing this story. Together, we can ensure that the lessons of history, the real ones, the human ones, are never lost.